Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Ansel Hartnell. And before anyone called it an epidemic, life in our little town ran on a tight loop of open houses, paint samples, and weekend plans. Interior contracting paid the steady bills. Real estate commissions paid for the extras. And when a deal closed clean, Greer and I could vanish for 2 nights and come back feeling human again. Greer Hartnell is a forensic accountant, the kind of person who is calm, practical, and spots trouble while it's still 3 miles down the road. She watched me sketching one night and told me, "If you're building something for us, Anal, make sure it works in bad weather." And I listened. 40 minutes outside town, past the last street light, and where the pavement finally gives up for gravel, sits our small cabin on a patch of woods I bought years ago. But behind it, hidden in a strong cluster of pines, is the real reason this story exists. A luxury treehouse built as a floating glass cube. It's warm lit inside, compact and modern, and not much bigger than a high-end hotel suite. It has windows on every side, a kitchenette, a bed, and 2 chairs positioned perfectly for drinking coffee while rain tracks down the glass. It was never meant to be a fortress or a bunker. It was strictly meant to be a weekend reset button, a place where phones stayed in a drawer and the forest was loud enough to drown out the stress of the work week. Construction finished months before the world fell apart. Then autumn came in hard and the rain just wouldn't stop. Ditches stayed full, trails turned to grease, and the air always smelled heavy with wet leaves and pine sap. Back in town, small things started to shift first. Showings got cancelled, people stopped shaking hands, shelves looked thinner every time we went in for basics. Then came the night every phone in the county lit up with the same piercing emergency alert. After that, messages stopped loading and calls dropped into a dead zone. The silence that followed didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like a door closing somewhere we couldn't see yet. The treehouse didn't start as a survival bunker or an emergency plan. It started strictly as a weekend daydream because work had completely hijacked our lives. We were burning the candle at both ends. And the idea only became real when Greer finally looked up from her laptop one night, rubbed her eyes, and said, "We keep paying to rest in other people's places. Let's build one place that is ours." The funding came from 2 veins of the same hustle. By day, I ran general contracting projects, kitchens, bathrooms, whole house updates. The kind where you manage 3 different crews, juggle tight schedules, and still come home with drywall dust permanently settled in your hair. On the side, I flipped houses, buying the ugliest bird dog on the block and fixing it up nights and weekends. Every time a deal closed clean, we didn't upgrade our trucks. A chunk went into a separate account. It wasn't money someday. It was to do it now before life gets any louder money. The cabin on our land came first. It was small and plain. Really, just a conditioned shell with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a serious workshop in the back for my tools. That workshop was my sanctuary, stocked with everything from table saws to spare fasteners. And we kept the pantry loaded with heavy staples in a row of 5-gallon water jugs. Mostly because storm season out here knocks out the well pump pretty often. The land itself sits outside town, deep enough that you don't hear the highway drone, but close enough to reach without burning a whole tank of gas. Behind the cabin, the woods tighten up and the ground rolls toward a creek that swells in the fall. Greer liked the higher ridgeline because it stayed firmer after heavy rains, and because the trees there were older pines spaced wide enough to let the wind pass through without taking anything down. At first I sketched out a traditional treehouse, wood walls, a little porch, something rustic like you'd see in a magazine. Then I toured a modern rental for a listing client. A glass cube suspended in the branches with warm light inside and clean lines. Expensive looking without being massive. The design stuck in my head for weeks, though Greer wasn't immediately swept up by the aesthetics. She studied the initial sketches and asked, "How do we keep it private, and how do we keep it warm when the weather turns?" which forced me to rethink the scale. Keeping it small became the first rule. A big structure catches wind like a sail, shows through the canopy, and gives people a reason to hike in and see what that is. The cube would be about the size of a master bedroom suite, one room that could shift from lounge to sleeping, a kitchenette, and a tight corner for changing and basic hygiene. The point was comfort, not square footage. Picking the trees mattered more than any finish. One tree is never a guarantee, so the frame had to spread weight across a cluster. A carpenter friend walked the lot with me, and he kept doing the same simple checks, looking for straight trunks, healthy crowns, and roots that weren't sitting in wet soil. We chose 3 mature pines in a rough triangle, close enough that a platform could tie into all of them, but far enough apart so they wouldn't grind against the structure in heavy wind. The spot stayed hidden. Construction happened in stages. Frame first, braced and leveled, then the floor, then walls. Glass came last, and that day felt different because glass changes what a place is. The installers moved slowly and carefully, treating the panels like jewels, and Greer stayed in the clearing, watching them swing on straps. When the last piece locked in, she stepped inside, looked around at the wet leaves and the gray sky outside, and said, "Okay, this is the first place that makes me stop thinking about work." And for a while, that was all it had to be. It was built as a weekend retreat, not a full-time home. Power ran up from the cabin via a buried line, enough for lights, charging, a small fridge, and a few outlets. Water was basic, a small tank and a pump for dishes. Heat was light duty, a small electric unit for chilly nights, and a backup propane heater. I had actually bought a small wood-burning tent stove for the place, a nice little cast iron unit, but I never got around to cutting the hole in the roof for the chimney pipe. I didn't want to mess with the waterproofing during the rainy season, so the stove stayed boxed up on a shelf in the cabin workshop, waiting for a someday project. Because it was all glass, privacy and heat loss had to be handled without ruining the look. The fix was modular. Thermal curtains rode in slim tracks and stayed pulled back during the day, then closed at night, so the room held warmth and nobody could read our silhouettes. Blackout shades were tucked into the ceiling frames, the kind you don't notice until they drop. We also added a clear insulating film on the inside of the glass, almost invisible unless sunlight hit it just right, which cut down fogging. Storm panels were the last layer, thin and temporary. They stayed stacked at the cabin most of the time because the whole point was the view. But they could be clipped on fast if the wind got ugly or if we needed the cube to look dark from a distance. The entry was simple, a hatch and a ladder, and we treated it like a mudroom. A stiff brush sat by the opening along with a small towel and sanitizer because nobody wants dirt ground into a small space. Greer added a plastic bin for wet shoes and a littered bag for trash, and she told me, if we don't stay clean, we'll feel it fast in a box this size. Most weekends out there were easy. We'd arrive with groceries, change into sweatshirts, and let the rain do its thing against the glass while we cooked and talked. The forest looked close enough to touch, but the cube stayed dry and warm, and it felt like a private hideout that nobody else knew existed. Then the wet autumn came in hard. It was week after week of steady rain, and the town started to feel off in small practical ways. Cancelled showings, contractors not returning calls, a grocery aisle that didn't refill for 3 days straight. Greer noticed at first. She stood in the kitchen with a half-empty grocery bag and said, "Something is shifting, and it's not just the weather." And though the cube in the trees was still just a weekend place, it was sitting there ready. And that thought started following us home. By mid-October, the rain was constant, a gray curtain that just wouldn't lift. In a small town that usually talks about nothing but high school football and the corn harvest, the weather should have been the headline story. But it wasn't anymore. The atmosphere had shifted. People started talking in half sentences, clipped and quiet, like they were testing a rumor and watching your face to see if you were crazy enough to believe it. It started for me at the grocery store checkout. The cashier, a woman named Brenda I'd exchanged pleasantries with for a decade, stopped scanning my items and leaned over the conveyor belt, dropping her voice to a whisper as she asked, "You hear what's going on over in Riverton?" Riverton is the next city over, a 30-minute drive. So I asked what she meant, assuming it was political gossip or a bad wreck. She shrugged, her eyes darting to the manager's booth, and said, "My cousin works intake at the hospital. She says they're full, anal, and she says it's not the usual stuff filling up the beds." Before I could press her, the next customer rolled his cart up, and Brenda snapped back to a plastic smile like the moment never happened, scanning a bag of apples with trembling hands. Work picked up the same static. My phone, usually buzzing with new leads, turned into a stream of cancellations and weird excuses. A tile guy I used for bathroom jobs texted me, "Supply yard is limiting orders. They're saying it's temporary supply chain issues," which felt like a lie. Later, a listing client called to push her photo shoot back because her sister's school was doing something with a quarantine. She laughed while she said it, like the word was embarrassing, a joke she didn't quite get, but her voice had that tight, high-pitched edge people get when they're trying very hard not to sound scared. Greer didn't laugh at any of it. She's a forensic accountant. Her entire career is built on noticing when the numbers don't add up. One night she looked up from her laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in her glasses, and said, "County health numbers are delayed by 48 hours. That doesn't happen unless someone is buying time to figure out what to tell the public." It wasn't a big, dramatic speech. It was the same flat, factual tone she uses when a spreadsheet stops lining up, which made it terrifying. The TV news stayed soft and careful, using phrases like isolated incidents and no cause for panic. But the only real information came from how people moved in public. The social contract was breaking down in real time. Nobody wanted to stand close in line. Nobody wanted to touch the same door handle. I watched a man in the hardware aisle snap at a teenager just for clearing his throat, barking at the kid to back off. The kid didn't argue, he just abandoned his cart and walked out. As the week dragged on, the rumor changed shape. It stopped being a bad flu and started being people acting wrong. A client sent me a shaky clip from downtown Riverton that someone had ripped from a live stream. It showed police cars, an ambulance, and a guy in a stained t-shirt fighting two first responders like he didn't feel pain. The video cut right when the man turned his head and bit down on a paramedic's shoulder. And that single jerky motion stayed in my head when I tried to sleep. Greer watched it once, closed the tab, and said, "That isn't drugs. Either he's confused past the point of reason, or he knows exactly what he's doing." The next day, my phone filled with cancellations, and they weren't polite anymore. They were short, panicked messages that didn't sound like the people I knew. One read, "We're staying in. Cancel the walkthrough," and another simply said, "Can you mail the paperwork?" A contractor I trusted wrote, "Cops blocked the river bridge, don't come into town." And when I tried calling him back, the voicemail picked up immediately, and then the call dropped. Like the network itself was too tired to carry the signal. Driving through town felt like driving through a wake. A line formed outside the pharmacy before it even opened. People in yellow, rain jackets, staring at the locked glass door like it was the last stable thing left on Earth. The gas station in Maine had both pumps full and cars stacked 3 deep behind each one. Inside, the clerk had a cardboard sign taped to the counter that read, "Cash only, system down." And he kept glancing at the entrance every time the door chime rang, his hand hovering near something beneath the counter. That afternoon, a sheriff's cruiser rolled down our street. No lights, no siren, just cruising slow enough that everyone noticed. Greer stood by the window, holding her coffee mug with both hands, and said, "They're not doing that for show. They're checking for looters." 10 minutes later, Mrs. Danner from 2 houses down knocked on our door. Her hair was plastered to her forehead from the rain, and when I opened the door, there was a crack with the chains still on. She didn't even say hello. She just asked, "Anal, you got any extra bottled water? The tap pressure is low." I felt a pang of guilt knowing about the massive 5-gallon jugs we had stored out at the cabin, but here in the house, we were running low. I told her, "We have a case in the pantry, but that's it. I can spare a few bottles." She nodded like she expected that and leaned in, whispering, My niece is a nurse. She texted me to lock the doors, stay off the roads, and if anyone shows up sick, don't open the door for anything. After she left, clutching 3 bottles of water like gold bars, Greer locked the deadbolt and said, "If nurses are warning families to stay away, it's already past the stage where normal rules help." Phones still worked, but barely. Videos loaded in short bursts and froze. Calls would connect, go silent, then drop. Group chats filled with people asking if this was real, others telling them to stop spreading panic, and then someone posting another clip. A person staggering through a Walmart parking lot with blood on their chin. Greer's office sent a temporary remote work email, and then her boss tried to call, but the line cut out so fast it didn't matter. Near dusk, I drove past the high school and saw a line of cars creeping into the lot, headlights reflecting in the puddles. A sign by the entrance read "Community Assistance," and someone had spray painted a second jagged line under it. No room. A man in a poncho walked between the cars, waving them away without even looking at the drivers' faces. Back home, Greer laid it out in her plain, practical way. She sat at the kitchen island and said, "We have food here for a week, maybe 2 if we starve ourselves. But we have power, tools, and real water filtration at the cabin in the cube is built to stay dry." She meant the property outside town. If we wait until everyone decides to leave at once, the roads turn into a parking lot and the grocery store turns into a fist fight. I wanted to push back, mostly because leaving felt like admitting the world had actually changed. But then sirens rose near the river. First one, then a chorus, and then they all cut off at the exact same time, like someone had flipped a master switch. At 9:17 p.m., every phone in the room lit up with the same harsh emergency alert tone. The screen read, "Curfew effective immediately. Avoid contact with aggressive or confused persons. Do not approach the hospital district." After that, nothing else came through. No updates, no follow-up, just the sound of rain tapping the windows and a dead spinning icon where messages used to be. Greer looked at me, her face pale in the screen light, and said, "We leave at first light." And in my head, the treehouse stopped being a weekend idea and turned into the only plan that made any sense. Greer didn't sleep much after that alert. Around midnight, she started pacing the house with her phone in her hand, not because the signal worked, but because the flashlight did. She checked the back door, the garage latch, and the window locks with the intensity of someone closing down a hazardous job site. Morning came gray and wet, and the first thing we heard was rain drumming in the gutters and an engine idling too long somewhere up the street. Greer set a mug of black coffee on the counter and said, "We're not doing a big goodbye tour. We pack what keeps us alive for a few days, we get to the cabin, and we figure it out from there." That was the tone that ended arguments. So, the kitchen island became a tactical staging table. Food went first. We skipped the fun stuff and went for the dense stuff. Cans of beans, soup, tuna, chili, and fruit slid into a tote, followed by rice, pasta, oats, and a jar of peanut butter that always lived in the back of the pantry. Greer added salt, coffee, and honey, looking at me as she packed them, and said, "Color matter, but morale matters just as much." We grabbed 2 gallons of drinking water from the basement and a case of bottles from the garage. It wasn't a massive amount for 3 people, but I knew the cabin pantry was already stocked with the heavy 5-gallon jugs we kept for storm season. So, this was just to get us there without tapping into the reserves. Medical was Greer's lane. She grabbed our household first aid kit, dumped it, and rebuilt it on the counter, adding gauze, tape, antiseptic, strong pain meds, allergy pills, and the prescriptions we actually needed. She bagged everything in a Ziploc, labeled them with a Sharpie, and said, "If we are wet and cold, a small cut turns into a big problem fast." Clothes were boring but vital. Thermal layers, wool socks, rain shells, work gloves, hats, extra underwear, and 1 heavy wool blanket went into duffels. Greer tossed in a box of heavy-duty trash bags because they do 100 jobs. And I added a handful of lighters because making heat on purpose is the difference between misery and comfort. Tools were the line between being a refugee and being a resident. I packed a pry bar, duct tape, thick plastic sheeting, and a compact tool bag with a hammer and screws. I made sure to grab the cordless drill, every spare battery I had, and my kit of whole saws. I knew that a boxed-up tent stove was waiting in the workshop, and if we were going to survive the cold, I'd finally need to cut a chimney hole in the roof to install it. Defense was the part neither of us enjoyed talking about in this town. Hunting guns aren't exotic. They're household tools. Mine lived locked up because that's what you do when life is stable. Greer stood close while I opened the safe, and I told her, "We're not looking for trouble, but we're not pretending trouble can't find us." A pump shotgun went into a soft case, unloaded with shells in a separate pouch, and a small handgun went into a locked box with 2 magazines. Greer checked the lock and said, "If we ever have to pull this out, we're leaving immediately." Before we loaded the last tote, we shut the house down. Curtains closed, lights off, thermostat dropped, and a note on the counter with Greer's sister's number and one line saying we were out of town. It wasn't sentimental. It was practical, keeping the place from looking abandoned at a glance. Outside, the street looked normal from far away, but up close, it wasn't. A neighbor stood on his porch in a rain jacket, holding his phone up like he could force a signal to appear. He called out, asking where we were headed. Greer answered without breaking her stride and said, "To our cabin. You should stay inside and lock up." He gave a short, nervous laugh and said, "They say there's help at the high school." Greer shook her head and said, "People get hurt in crowds," then turned back to the truck. We rolled out just after sunrise. Cars were stacked at the gas station again, and someone was arguing with the clerk through the locked glass door. We didn't stop. The tank was full, and 2 red jerry cans sat strapped in the bed. At the last stoplight, a man in a soaked hoodie shuffled along the sidewalk. His head hung low, moving slow and wrong, and a woman across the street pulled her kid closer and crossed away from him without saying a word. Greer watched him in the side mirror and said, "Don't stop for anyone who looks sick." It sounded harsh until you remembered the alert told everyone the same thing. Once the pavement gave way to county blacktop and then gravel, the tension finally eased a fraction. Rain made the trees look darker, and the ditches were already running high. The cabin was still 40 minutes out, and the glass cube behind it was deeper in the woods. A new thought kept repeating in my head. If we reached that ridge and it was quiet, we could breathe. If it wasn't, we'd have to solve the next problem fast. No second chances. Rain followed us out of town, a relentless gray sheet that blurred the horizon. The farther we drove, the fewer signs there were that anyone still cared about maintaining the roads. The county blacktop had standing water in the low spots, looking like dark oil slicks, and every time we hit a puddle at speed, the tires hissed violently and the steering went light in my hands for a heart-stopping second. Greer kept the map app open on her phone, even though it barely loaded, scrolling through the grid more out of habit than actual help. She stared at the spinning wheel on the screen and said, "If we see a roadblock, Ansel, we turn around before we get boxed in. Do not hesitate. That was the morning rule. Keep moving, don't get trapped. And definitely don't assume anyone is coming to manage the mess." A few miles out, we passed a sedan on the shoulder with its driver's side door hanging half open and no one around it. The interior light was dead. Greer didn't even flinch. She just said, "Don't slow down," in the same flat final tone she uses when a conclusion is already decided. The route to the cabin is essentially one winding county road through farmland that eventually turns into a gravel cut climbing into the trees. Mailboxes still stood like centuries, and porch lights still flicked on in the gray afternoon, but nobody waved. Nobody lingered at the end of a driveway to watch the rain. At a four-way stop, 2 pickups sat nose to nose in the intersection, engines idling, like the drivers couldn't decide which way was safer to run. One man rolled his window down as I pulled up, leaned out into the rain and said, "River road's gone." When I asked him if he meant flooded or broken, he spat onto the asphalt and answered, "Both. Bridges washed out, and there's a pileup on the north side." Then he waved us away like he was done talking and peeled off to the west. We took the longer way, sticking to the ridges and staying off the low ground where the water would be rising. Greer's eyes kept moving, checking mirrors, ditches, and tree lines. Every time a shape stood too still on the side of the road, she leaned forward, squinting through the wiper blades like she was deciding if it was a person or just a stump in bad light. The first one we saw up close wasn't a stump. A man soaked through to the bone stood in a deep ditch near a tilted mailbox post. His head hung down, chin to chest, arms loose at his sides. The truck headlights caught his face as we passed, and it was pale, mouth slack and open. When he turned toward the road, his movement was slow and stiff, like his joints were rusted or he didn't quite remember how to use them. Greer didn't yell, she didn't gasp. She just gripped the dashboard handle and said, "Keep going." And the truck stayed steady. In the rear view mirror, I saw him take a few steps after us, slow and mechanical, before he just stopped and let the rain hit him again. By the time we hit the gravel cut, the rain was heavier and the road was already chewing itself apart. Runoff carved thin channels across the track, turning the gravel into a slurry. The trees closed in until the world went darker. Not night dark, just the kind of suffocating twilight you get under a wet canopy. Our cabin sat at the end of the road, a small shape in a clearing that looks the same every season. Mud, pine needles, and split wood under a blue tarp. When we pulled in, nothing moved. That was a relief, but it also felt off because something should have moved. A bird, a squirrel, anything. The silence was heavy. Greer got out first, hood up, and she walked the perimeter the way she walks a new office, checking doors without making a show of it. She tested the shed lock, glanced at the windows, then looked at the ground and said, "No one's been here." The mud near the steps is smooth. Inside, the air smelled like pine and cold metal. I flipped the switch and the power was still on, which surprised me, but the light clicked and held steady. Greer didn't celebrate. She dropped her bag and said, "Use it while it lasts." And the cabin immediately turned into a sorting station. Wet gear stayed near the door, shoes off. Jackets hung where they wouldn't drip on the bed, and a towel went down for the duffels. I went straight to the pantry and checked the bottom shelf. The row of 5-gallon water jugs I kept for storm season sat exactly where I left them, gathering dust. I exhaled for the first time in hours. Food stacked on the table. Medical went in one bin, tools and tape in another. Greer rebuilt the first aid kit again, quick and neat, and said, "If we're wet and tired, small problems get big. Let's stay dry." Once the basics were inside, the next job was the treehouse. The glass cube sitting deeper in the woods like a lantern we hadn't turned on yet. The path isn't straight, and I built it that way on purpose. A gentle curve through trunks that keeps the cube from being visible from the clearing. We walked it slowly because the ground was slick with wet needles and the rain masked small sounds. Slipping here could end the plan faster than any zombie. Water dripped off branches onto our shoulders, and the forest smelled intensely of wet leaves and sap. The cube came into view in pieces, a corner of glass, a dark frame. Then the full shape tucked among trees, compact and clean against all that messy green and brown. It looked the same as it had on calm weekends, but now the same walls that felt open and luxurious also felt like something that could draw eyes if we made mistakes. Greer stepped closer, wiped rain from her face and said, "It still looks like our place." Her voice softened for the first time all day, but then she added, "Let's keep it quiet and dark at night." The hatch was dry and sealed. The ladder pulled down smoothly. Inside, the air was warmer than the cabin because the glass created a greenhouse effect, and the space carried a faint stale smell of coffee from our last visit. We stood still and listened. No voices, no engines, no distant sirens, just rain on glass and the low creak of trees swaying in the wind. Then Greer froze. She pointed at the lower edge of one window and said, "That's new." When I crouched to look, I saw a smear of mud and a handprint on the outside glass. Fingers dragged down like someone tried to steady themselves and slid away. A second mark sat near it lighter, like a shoulder brushed the pane. It wasn't high up. It was near the base of the tree where the glass started. Greer didn't touch the glass. She stared at the print and said, "Someone was here." And we both looked out into the wet trees. Everything looked normal, and that was exactly what made it feel wrong. Back at the cabin, we shut the door and listened again. A faint sound carried through the rain. Not close, but not far either, like a shout swallowed by distance and wet air. Greer froze under the porch roof, tilted her head and said, "Did you hear that?" The sound came again, one strained call, and then silence. We both understood the next problem was already walking toward us from somewhere down near the creek. The call came again, thin and strained, cutting through the drumming rain like a wire. It didn't sound like a bird, and it definitely didn't sound like a hunter messing around. Greer looked at me, then scanned the dark tree line and said, "That's a person." The wind made the direction messy, swirling the sound around the trunks, but the voice had that tight, vibrating edge you only hear when someone is trying very hard not to panic. A fast cabin check came first, because leaving gear scattered is exactly how you lose it when things go sideways. Greer clipped a headlamp to her hood, even though it was daytime, knowing wet woods can turn into twilight fast, and she stuffed the trauma kit into her pack. I grabbed a long, heavy branch from the wood pile, something solid enough to break bone, and we headed downhill toward the creek. The slope was treacherous. The trail was half-running water, turning the clay into grease, so we had to plant our boots on roots and rocks, listening between the wind gusts. The shout hit again, closer this time, and it carried a single desperate word, "Help," followed by a wet, racking cough. Greer stopped, held up a hand, and whispered, "Listen." A second sound answered the shout. A slow, rhythmic shuffle in the brush that didn't match our pace. The ditch line down there sits beside an old logging turnoff where runoff cuts a deep channel. The road was a mess of puddles and ruts, but the ditch was worse. A brown trough full of moving water, dead leaves and slurry. A man was in it, half on his side, one leg buried deep in the mud, both hands clawing at the grassy bank to keep his head and chest out of the rising water. He looked up when he heard our boots on the gravel and gasped. Anal, his voice cracked like he couldn't believe we were real. "It's Hollis." It was Hollis Bracken, the mushroom guy who lived down the ridge. Greer didn't rush in blindly. Her eyes stayed locked on the tree line across the road as she hissed, "Hollis, stay quiet. We're here." He swallowed hard, his face gray, and said, "I was coming to your cabin. My place got loud last night. The creek came up and I slipped." Then he flinched, his eyes widening as he looked past us. They're behind me. Two slow figures pushed through the wet brush across the road. Their faces were pale, mouths hanging open, moving with a steady, mindless determination. Another shape drifted in from farther down the road, drawn by the sound of Hollis's breathing in our voices. I tightened my grip on the branch, but Greer put a hand on my arm and said, "No shooting. If we fire, we ring the dinner bell." She turned to the ditch. "Hollis, can you move that buried leg?" Hollis shook his head once, shivering violently. "It's stuck. The suction is too strong. The bank was too soft to yank him out by brute force. We just dislocated something." Greer pointed to a fallen limb near the shoulder and said, "We use this as a lever." She slid down onto her knees in the mud, planted the thick end of the limb under Hollis's thigh near the trapped leg, and ordered, "When I lift, you pull your knee toward your chest." "Do not fight me." Hollis nodded, his jaw shaking, and kept both hands gripping the bank. The first zombie reached the edge of the ditch and leaned in, arms stretching out like a sleepwalker. The branch in my hands became a simple tool. I stepped in, delivered a steady, hard shove to its shoulder, and turned it sideways. It slid into the mud with a wet flop, flailing. It kept grabbing at the air, but the slick bank stole its grip, and that bought us seconds. Another drifted closer, and I used the same move. A blunt strike to the chest to knock it off balance before it could get hands on Hollis. Behind me, Greer grunted with effort. "Again," she said, and she lifted higher on the lever. Hollis groaned, his face twisting in pain, and his knee rose a few inches. The mud made a loud, sickening sucking sound, and his leg shifted. "Now," Greer yelled. She grabbed the back of his collar. I grabbed his belt, and together we hauled him backward onto the road shoulder. Hollis tried to stand, but his ankle folded underneath him instantly, and he sucked in a breath that almost turned into a scream. Greer caught him and said, "Wait on me, move." A zombie reached for Hollis's trailing boot, its fingers closing on the rubber sole. I brought the branch down hard on its wrist, a dull crack, and the fingers opened. A final shove sent it tumbling back into the ditch water with a splash. Greer pulled Hollis away from the edge and said, "Breathe through your nose. Keep your mouth shut." Hollis nodded fast, whispering, "I'm sorry." Over and over like this was his fault. Getting back up the slope was a slow, grueling process. Hollis leaned heavily on me, limping on his good leg, while Greer walked rear guard, scanning left and right, keeping us out of the thicker brush where things could hide. Rain hit our movement, but it also made every foothold risky, and nobody wanted to go down with those slow bodies closing in behind us. Halfway up, Hollis finally spoke in a low voice. "I saw 3 of them in my driveway. I shut the door and I waited. And then I heard more," he said, then swallowed. "I remembered your place in the trees and I just started walking." Greer answered, "You did the right thing coming here," but she kept it short because the hill demanded all our air. At the cabin, the door closed, the deadbolt clicked, and the inside air felt too still. Greer sat Hollis on a sturdy chair and opened the first aid kit. She checked his ankle, then his hands, then his neck, searching for tears or scratches. She looked up and said, "No bites." Hollis stared at the floorboards, water dripping from his nose, and said, "Thank you." The reality settled heavily in the room. The cabin and the glass cube were built for weekends, not for 3 people trying to outlast a wet autumn. Greer wrapped his swollen ankle with a compression bandage and tape, securing it tight. Then she looked at me, her eyes calculating the daylight left, and said, "We move him to the treehouse before dark." Outside the rain kept falling, and down the slope farther, a slow shuffle answered another. Patient, relentless sounds, like they were looking for the noise we left behind. Moving Hollis from the cabin to the glass cube felt simple on paper, but looked like a disaster in practice. His limp made us slow, and the rain turned the hill into a slide, where one mistake meant a loud, bone-breaking fall. Greer packed light for the transfer, first aid on top, a headlamp, 2 bottles of water, and a small pouch of pills. And she said, "We go quiet, we go steady, and we don't stop on the slope." Since wheels sink in mud, a tarp and a length of rope became a basic dragging sled. The 3 of us moved as one awkward unit, step, pull, keeping the path shallow and winding so the cube stayed hidden from the clearing below. Hollis gritted his teeth against the jolts and muttered, "I can walk." But the violent shake in his good leg gave him away. Greer answered without stopping, "You can walk later. Right now, you keep your hands free and your mouth shut." The real problem was the hatch. The ladder was vertical, and Hollis couldn't climb it on one leg. I had to rig a makeshift harness using the rope and a locking carabiner I kept on my belt. Greer went up first to haul from the top, bracing herself against the frame. I stayed below, positioning Hollis on the ladder, and basically pressed his weight up one rung at a time while Greer pulled. It was slow, sweating work. When we finally rolled him onto the floorboards, we were all gasping. Inside the cube, the air smelled clean, all wood, and a faint chemical tang from the backup propane heater, and the rain drummed on the glass with that steady rhythm that makes you forget how loud the world can be. Space became the first argument we didn't want to have. The cube was built for 2 people, not a third adult who just got pulled out of a ditch. Hollis sat on the edge of the bed, mud on his pants, keeping his hands on his knees like he didn't want to dirty anything. Greer looked around once, assessing the tight quarters, then said, "We set rules now, not later." She grabbed a legal pad and wrote while she talked, her voice leaving no room for debate. "No one goes down alone," she said. "No one opens the hatch without saying it first. If you come back wet or cut, you show it before you step inside." Hollis nodded and said, "Yes, Greer." She claimed one corner by the hatch for wet gear and hygiene, setting up a bin for boots, a towel, sanitizer, and a littered bucket for the toilet setup. "Clean hands, dry socks," she said. "We get sick in here, we're done." Food turned into a quiet inventory. What we brought from town could cover a few days, but the cabin held the bulk of the calories, and that bulk had to move up without leaving a messy trail. The first run was just essentials. Rice, the small propane bottle that powered the stove top, and one of the heavy 5-gallon water jugs I'd hauled from the cabin pantry. I looked at the small electric heater humming in the corner and knew it wouldn't hold up if the temperature dropped. I made a mental note that the boxed-up wood stove in the workshop had to be the next project. Greer made a simple list on the wall. Water, food, batteries, meds, and she said, if we don't track it, we'll assume we have more than we do. Hollis tried to help even with his ankle propped up. He offered information instead of muscle and said, my mushroom shed has dried bags, clean plastic liners, and 5-gallon buckets with lids. Buckets meant storage, and storage meant fewer trips in the rain. Greer asked where the shed sat and how far it was from the creek, and Hollis answered in short directions, then added, I can draw a map. Night came early under the canopy. The curtain stayed open at first because the view was the whole point of this place, but the first time, a faint glow from a phone screen bounced off the wet glass. Greer reached for the switch and said, we're not a beacon. The blackout shade slid down and the cube went from luxury suite to bunker without changing its shape. Sleep was another puzzle. 1 bed, 1 couch, 1 floor, and 3 bodies. Greer said, we rotate. And she pointed to the couch, then to the bed, then to the corner by the hatch where a sleeping pad could fit. Hollis started to protest, but Greer cut him off and said, you're injured, you take the bed. Hollis hesitated, looking at us, and said, I don't want to be dead weight. To which she replied, you're not, you made it here. The first night was a series of small wakes. The rain changed the pitch. Branches tapped the frame, and every sound made the brain search for a pattern. Hollis woke once and whispered, I hear them. Greer sat up in the dark, listened for a long moment, then said, that's water on leaves. Keep breathing. The calm in her voice kept the room from turning into a panic box. Morning brought routine. A quick check of the hatch seal, a look through the glass for movement. Then coffee made on the small burner with the vent cracked just enough to keep air fresh. Hollis ate slowly and said, back at my place, I kept thinking someone would knock and explain it. Greer answered, nobody is coming to explain it. By day 2, the cabin below became a supply depot. Trips happened in pairs, timed for heavier rain because downpour covered footsteps and made the woods louder than us. I rigged a simple rope and pulley system to the deck railing so loads could rise without a lot of banging against the siding. Hollis stayed inside with the shotgun case nearby, watching through a narrow gap in the shade like he was trying to learn the new normal. The first slow zombies drifted through. On the 3rd day, 2 of them came up the lower trail, heads tilted, stopping and starting, drawn by nothing we could see. They reached the clearing near the cabin, bumped into a wood pile, and 1 fell. Then both stood again and kept wandering, patient and stupid. From the cube, they looked harmless until the wind shifted and a low moan floated up through the wet trees. The sound made the place feel instantly smaller. Greer watched them from the window and said, if they pile up under us, we can't just pretend they aren't there. Hollis swallowed hard and said, they don't get tired, do they? The only answer was the rain and those slow shapes turning in circles below. And that was when the weekend treehouse truly became our address, whether we liked it or not. The cube was comfortable for a weekend getaway, but weekend systems have a bad habit of quitting when you ask them to run every hour of every day. The first thing that betrayed us was the glass itself. Warm air inside met the freezing rain outside, and by morning, the lower panes were fogged and dripping. The water tracked down to the floor like a slow, bleeding leak we couldn't fix with a wrench. Greer pointed at the wet corners where a small puddle was already forming on the wood and said, moisture is going to ruin us before anything down there does. She wasn't being dramatic. Wet clothes never fully dried. The air felt heavier with every breath, and even the food started tasting like damp cardboard because the room stayed sealed too tight. We needed dry heat, and we needed it fast. The little electric unit was useless without steady grid power, and the propane heater was just pumping more moisture into the air while chewing through our limited supply. I knew what I had to do. During a break in the heavy rain, I went down to the cabin workshop and retrieved the boxed-up cast iron tent stove I'd bought a year ago. Bringing it up was a headache, but installing it was nerve-wracking surgery. I had to cut a 4-inch hole through the roof structure for the chimney pipe, praying I didn't crack the adjacent glass or ruin the weatherproofing. I used high-temp silicone and a rubber flashing boot to seal the gap, working fast while Greer held the ladder steady. When I finally lit the first small fire using driplet wood from the cabin pile, the difference was instant. The stove threw out a dry, radiating heat that killed the dampness in the air and kept the glass clear. Greer held her hands out to the iron box and said, "Okay, now we can actually live here." Drafts were next. The hatch and frame were solid, but the wind found the smallest gaps, creating thermal bridges that sucked the heat out. I used foam strips and a roll of weather tape from my tool bag to turn those tiny whistles into silence. And we laid a thick rug near the ladder so wet boots didn't turn the floor into a skating rink. Power became a discipline instead of a convenience. Everything rechargeable lived in one basket: headlamps, batteries, the small power bank, and Greer wrote a strict charge schedule on the legal pad. She tapped the paper with a pen and said, "Top off when we can and don't waste light when you can sit in the dark." We brought up a small folding solar panel from the cabin, but under the heavy canopy and grey sky. It only provided a weak trickle charge. It was better than nothing, but we treated it like a bonus, not a guarantee. Water was the other logistical nightmare because the cube had only a small weekend tank. With rain falling constantly, we decided to make it useful without turning the place into a science project. I clipped a narrow gutter strip to the roof edge and ran a short hose down to a covered container hidden at the base of the trees. When we needed water, we hauled a jug up through the hatch with a rope. It went through a ceramic filter and then into clean bottles. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Food storage had to change too, because damp air and mice don't care about your survival plans. This was where Hollis stepped up. His mushroom-growing buckets were perfect food-grade hard plastic with tight sealing lids. He wiped one down and said, "These kept my substrate sterile for months. They'll keep your rice clean." We moved the dry goods into those buckets, labeled them with tape, and turned the cooler into a sealed pantry. The cabin stayed in the bulk warehouse, but the cube now held enough calories for several days, meaning we didn't have to risk a trip down every time someone got hungry. Greer built the hygiene corner into a routine, not a suggestion. A littered bucket toilet sat behind a simple hanging curtain with sawdust and heavy-duty trash bags stacked beside it. A small handwash station lived near the hatch, a jug with a spout, soap and paper towels in a sealed bin. Wet wipes became currency. Greer was militant about it. Every time someone came up the ladder, boots went into the bin first, hands got cleaned second, and only then did we touch food or bedding. Storm panels were the last upgrade, and we treated them like a spare tire. They stayed stacked at the cabin, but we brought 2 up to the cube so we could cover the most visible sides if we had to. Greer ran her palm over the mounting frame and said, "This is for wind and for people." Nobody argued with that. By the end of the week, the cube still looked like the same luxury box in the trees when daylight hit it, but inside, it ran like a life support system. The air was drier thanks to the wood stove. The heat was renewable. The water had a cycle, and the rules kept the space from turning into chaos. None of it changed what waited below, and that was the point. The fewer reasons we had to step onto the wet ground, the longer we could stay quiet while the slow shapes kept drifting through the woods. The rain never really quit. It just changed gears. Sometimes it was a mist that soaked you without noise, and other times it was a hammer that drowned out your own thoughts. That meant the woods never reset. Every footprint we made stayed sharp in the liquid mud, and every branch we brushed against shook water down like a signal flare. After a few days in the cube, the slow zombies became a routine problem, and that was its own kind of danger because routine makes you careless. Most mornings started with the same quiet ritual. Greer woke first, slid one blackout shade up an inch, and watched the cabin clearing below without turning on a single lumen of light. If nothing moved down there, she eased it higher and whispered, "Looks clear." And that was our green light to start the day. Coffee came next, small and quiet, brewed on the wood stove top to save gas. Then came the checklist: water level, food buckets, battery charge, and the weather. Because the rain ultimately decided what we could do on the ground. Hollis learned the rhythm of the space fast. He hated being stuck inside. You could see it in his leg bouncing, but he used the time well. He took over the maintenance, wiping residual condensation off the lower glass, tightening tape on a drafty corner, and keeping trash strictly organized so the room didn't start smelling like a campsite. When his ankle loosened enough for him to stand longer, he looked at us and asked, "If I can't haul heavy loads yet, what actually helps?" Greer didn't sugarcoat it. She answered, "Keep us organized and keep your eyes open. And if you see something, say it once clearly. Don't guess." The slow ones didn't hunt like predators, they drifted like debris in a current. They followed the sound, then forgot why, then drifted again. The rain helped us because it covered small noises, but it also made them harder to read. A wet jacket brushing against the glass can sound like a hand, and a branch tapping the frame can sound like fingernails. More than once, someone froze midship, head tilted, and Greer would listen before whispering, "It's just the wind." And we'd wait until our breathing felt normal again. A couple of times a day, one of us would scan for patterns. The zombies favored the path of least resistance, the low trail near the creek, and they moved in the same slow lane with heads down and arms loose. It looked stupid, but it was predictable, and predictability is useful if you respect it. That didn't mean they were harmless. One afternoon, two of them wandered into the cabin clearing and simply didn't leave. They circled the wood pile and the porch steps like the place confused them, and their low moans carried up through the wet leaves, making the cube feel instantly smaller. Hollis watched them from the window gap and said, "If they stay camped out there, you can't go down for supplies." Greer answered without looking away from the glass, "Then we don't go down, we will wait for them out." Like it really was that simple. By evening, the moaning pulled in more of them. A third appeared. Then a fourth, and suddenly, the clearing held a small cluster. They leaned into the cabin door and bumped the siding. Not hard enough to break it fast, but hard enough to make the structure below the creak. Greer kept the shades down tight and said, "No lights tonight, we disappear." And the cube went dark while the cabin took the abuse below. From that point on, supply runs had strict rules. We waited for heavier rain to mask the sound, then moved in short bursts, staying on roots and rocks so we didn't leave a clean path in the mud. The long rope and pulley I'd rigged became our lifeline. When we reached the cabin, we clipped a tote to the rope and sent it up hand over hand. So the loud part of hauling happened inside the insulated cube, not outside. Hollis stayed up top and managed the catch. Not with a hero posture, just with steady eyes and a hand on the blackout shade. Food stayed simple and quiet. Nobody wanted to cook something that smelled strong, and nobody wanted to waste fuel. Rice, oats, and canned meat filled most meals, and Hollis added dried mushrooms from his emergency bag. A few handfuls that made the room smell earthy and normal for a minute. Greer looked at the small pile of dried fungi and said, "We stretch that, it has to last." Hollis nodded and said, "I can grow more later. If we get time and I can clean some buckets, I can get a culture going." Water was steady because the rain kept feeding our catch container, but filters don't last forever, and Greer treated each jug like it mattered. She measured what we used without making a speech about it. When I rinsed a pot for a second too long, she reached over, shut the spout, and said, "We don't waste clean water. Wipe it, don't rinse it." And that was the end of it. The cube had power while the line from the cabin held, but we treated it like a finite resource. The headlamp stayed off unless needed. Charging happened in the afternoon when the sky was bright enough for the solar panel to pull a trickle charge. Then everything went back into the basket. Greer said, "A bright room is a signal fire, and the shade stays down once the sun starts dropping." Sleep was the hardest part, not because the bed was bad, but because the woods never felt empty anymore. Some nights the zombies below were loud, and at least you knew where they were. Other nights they went quiet, and that silence made every small sound inside the cube feel sharp enough to cut. One night near midnight, a dull vibration shuddered through the floorboards. Not a slam, but a heavy thud, like something large hitting the base of our trees. Everyone woke at once. Greer sat up and whispered, "Nobody moves." We listened. Another vibration came up through the trunk, followed by the slow, dry sound of fingernails scraping against pine bark 20 ft below. Hollis breathed out. "They're at the base, they're touching the trees." Greer kept her voice low and steady, saying, "Stay still. They can't climb, and they don't look up unless we give them a reason. They'll lose interest." We waited in the dark while rain and time did their work. After an agonizing minute, the scraping stopped and the shuffling moved away, dissolving into the wet forest. Nobody spoke for a long time. When Greer finally exhaled, she said, "That's why the room stays dark. We don't exist to them." And it wasn't a lecture, it was just the rule of law. By the end of the week, the cube had a rhythm. Wake, check, ration, haul, wipe dry, and listen. The slow zombies weren't a single event anymore. They were a pressure that never left. And the longer it lasted, the more it tested every small decision. The first time the rain eased, and a pale strip of actual blue sky showed through the canopy. Greer looked at it and said, "When the weather gives us a window, we use it to restock." And that sounded like a simple plan until you remembered we'd have to step back onto the wet ground to do it at all. Human trouble arrived the way it usually does. Quiet at first, then suddenly too close to ignore. It wasn't a gang with a flag or anything dramatic like you see in movies. It was just a couple of people in a vehicle that shouldn't have been up our gravel cut, moving with the slow, predatory confidence of men who expected to find something worth taking. It happened on a late afternoon when the heavy rain had finally backed off to a cold drizzle. Greer was standing at the glass wall with a blackout shade lifted just a finger width when she froze. She didn't turn around, she just said, "Truck," in a flat, hard voice that made my stomach drop. Through the gaps in the pine branches, a dark lifted pickup crawled along the county road below, moving slow enough that the driver could scan the clearings. Then, without hesitating, it turned onto our gravel cut and started climbing. Hollis shifted on the couch, wincing as he moved his bad leg, and whispered, "That's not mine. My truck is white." Greer immediately lowered the shade, sealing the gap, and hissed, "No lights. Nobody moves." The cube went dim, and we stood in the absolute dark, listening to the wet crunch of tires on gravel getting louder as the truck climbed the ridge. The engine cut off abruptly at the cabin. A door opened and closed with a heavy thud. Voices carried up to us in pieces, not yelling, just talking at a normal volume like they had all the time in the world. One voice drifted up low and grayly, saying, "The place looks clean, too clean." Another voice answered with a scoff, "Means someone's using it, check the back." Greer looked at me in the dim light and mouthed, "They're not lost." A minute later, the cabin door handle rattled. Then the door banged against the frame. Once, twice, like someone was testing the deadbolt with a shoulder. Hollis breathed out a shaky exhale and whispered, "If they check the meter, they'll see the new conduit running into the ground. They'll know there's power going somewhere else." He was right. The line from the cabin to the cube was buried, but the fresh conduit on the exterior wall was a dead giveaway to anyone who knew construction. Greer leaned close to the hatch, her hand hovering near the lock, and whispered, "Nobody goes down. If they come up here, we stay quiet until they force us not to." The shotgun case sat by the wall. I touched the nylon fabric, then stopped myself because loading a gun is loud, and the first problem wasn't fighting. It was being seen. Footsteps moved around the clearing below. Heavy boots squelching in the mud. Someone opened the tool shed, metal clink-edged against metal. A box slid across the floor. The first voice laughed a sharp, ugly sound and said, "Empty." The other voice answered, closer now, "Not empty. Picked clean, there's a difference." The footsteps came back out to the center of the clearing. For a split second, I saw them through a hairline gap in the shades. Two men in dark rain jackets, one holding a heavy pry bar, the other holding a tactical flashlight, even though it was still daylight. They didn't look panicked or sick. They looked calm, like this was just work. One of them walked to the edge of the clearing and stared up into the trees, head tilted. He wasn't looking at the cube directly. He was looking at the ground. He saw something. Maybe a faint track we missed, a scuff on a route where we'd hauled a tote, or just the spot where the mud didn't match the rest of the forest floor. He pointed, and the other man followed his finger. Greer's hand tightened on the shade cord until her knuckles turned white. Hollis whispered terror in his voice. "They're going to walk it. They're coming up." Greer answered, "Maybe." Then she waited, and the waiting felt longer than anything else we'd endured. They took a few steps into the woods, slow and careful. The rain had softened everything, but it also made our older marks stand out, and I hated that we had been so proud of moving quietly, because quiet still leaves evidence. Greer shifted closer to the window, positioning herself, and whispered to me, "If they get close, I talk, not you." I started to ask why, but she cut me off and added, "They'll read a male voice as a challenge to fight. Mine is just a boundary." The men stopped after 20 yards. One lifted his flashlight, sweeping the powerful beam low across the trunks, then higher into the canopy. The beam hit wet glass somewhere on the cube and jumped. Not a bright flash, just a glint, but it was enough for him to pause. His head turned, and for a half-second he looked straight at where we stood, hidden behind the shade. Nobody moved. The cube stayed dark. The curtain edge didn't twitch. After a long, heart-stopping beat, the man lowered the light and said something I couldn't hear. His partner looked up, shrugged, and answered with a short curse. They backed out of the trees, not retreating fast, just choosing to leave. Back at the truck, the pry bar clattered into the bed, the doors shut, and the engine rumbled to life. Before they pulled out, one of them turned and looked back at the ridge. Even through the rain, I could feel the idea forming in his stare. Not that he'd lost, but that he'd found a reason to return later. When the truck finally rolled away down the gravel cut, Hollis let out a shaky breath and said, "They'll come back." That evening, under the cover of heavier rain, we moved the most obvious totes back into the cabin to make it look ransacked, and I brushed the path with a pine bow to erase our history. Greer watched me work and said, "We make it harder to notice, and we make it easy to disappear." Outside, the drizzle thickened again, and the woods swallowed the road noise, but the problem didn't feel gone. It felt scheduled. Weeks later, the rain is still the soundtrack, and the season feels stuck on a gray, wet loop. The mornings are dim, the dark comes early, and the leaves never fully dry. The only real difference is inside us. We stopped waiting for a normal update and started treating every day like the system is already gone for good. The glass cube in the trees is the same shape it was when it was just a weekend architectural project. It still looks beautiful in the daylight. Clean lines, warm wood, and a view that makes you forget the world is burning for a minute. But at night, it runs strictly as a shelter. Shades down, curtains closed, lights low, and the wood stove humming quietly to keep the damp out. Every tool sits in the same spot every time, so nobody fumbles in the dark. Greer keeps us steady. She doesn't give speeches. She just makes small unbreakable rules and follows them. And after a while, you catch yourself doing the same thing. Hollis keeps finding ways to be useful. His ankle healed enough for him to move carefully, and he turned his mushroom grower mindset into a survival mindset. Keep things clean, keep things sealed, and never waste what can grow back. Down below, the slow zombies still drift through like bad weather. Some days we see none. Some days we count 6 or 7, moving along the creek trail, bumping into trees, pausing then shuffling on. They don't climb, they don't plan, they just fill space, and that's enough to make the ground feel like a trap. The harder part is the people. That black pickup truck that found our road proved what Greer already knew. Quiet places become targets, so we stay bored. No bright lights, no loud construction, no routines that someone can watch in time from the tree line. When we go down to the cabin, we go fast. We take what we need, and we come right back up. Food is simple, water is filtered, heat is controlled, hygiene is not optional. None of that is glamorous, but it keeps you alive long enough to care about anything else. Some nights when the rain eases up, Greer sits by the glass with her coffee, watching the dark shapes of the pines and says, "I miss ordinary problems, I miss tax audits." Hollis usually laughs once, sharp and short, and then the room goes quiet again. If this story has a point, it's not that a luxury treehouse saves you. It's that having one good place built before the panic starts gives you a head start when the panic finally shows up. We built it for weekends, we're using it for survival. And as long as the woods stay wet and the roads stay hungry, we're going to keep it dark, keep it quiet, and keep it ours. Tomorrow we'll check the roof clips, refill the water jugs, and see if those tire tracks return, because nothing stays settled for long here. If you enjoyed the story, please hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next.